So now, if I can, I'm going to move on to Dave. And Dave has got a great oversight of the industry from his role in CAP and his role in the, in the business for so many years. And Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can share your perspective with us. I think it should be really valuable.
Hey, thanks, Jim, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in the webinar. I'm going to build on Kate and Eddie's comments by touching on three areas. The first being just a little bit of a perspective on how I view the current external context in which we find ourselves. Second, a few thoughts on what's going on in terms of investment in technology and innovation in Alberta. And then third, some thoughts on key considerations that I think we should have in mind as we try and frame up an approach going forward. So just to ground my remarks, let me start with a few thoughts on the external context. And I think one way to look at this is I think we've got, might characterize it as two trains on a bit of a collision course with each other at the moment. On the one hand, I'm an engineer, but I can do the economist thing. On the one hand, on the other hand, we've got extremely ambitious climate aspirations in a Canadian context, as reflected in the GHG reduction targets that have been established toward achieving net zero by 2050. It's characterized clearly by significant political momentum in response to the prevailing climate science, and as recently reflected in the outcome of COP26. We've got increasing activism and intervention by the financial community in many different ways. Certainly societal momentum spurred by much of the media. I think, as I see it, at least unprecedented government policy and regulatory intervention, which is most visibly evident, I think, in the policy direction currently being pursued by our federal government, and significant growth in investment in clean technology in its many forms. On the other hand, we've got a number of what I would characterize as hard realities related to the net zero aspiration. And these need to be confronted and addressed, I think, if we're going to make progress. And we do need to make progress. I think both Kate and Eddie touched on the need for continued affordable, reliable energy systems in support of growing energy demand. Hydrocarbons are going to have to play a role in the system for quite some time, I believe. I think there's a question as to the capacity and capability and foresight maybe of policymakers to intervene with clarity in our energy, economic, and social systems, as the current trends suggest that they will and have the intention to. I think you can almost argue it's unprecedented in a peacetime environment to see the level of intervention that may be forthcoming from governments. And I think the related issue that doesn't get an awful lot of attention is the ability of the regulators to actually manage the download that is inevitably coming their way. Fair enough to talk about policy, but that ultimately ends up in the regulatory system. Just the sheer enormity of the financial and physical infrastructure challenges that are going to be necessary to essentially reconstruct, if you will, our energy systems over the next 30 years or so. And I think there's a very important question about the realistic pace at which technology, transformative technology, can be developed and deployed at scale. And Kate highlighted the fact that if we're looking at 2030, it's technology we know about today that's going to have to lead to those changes, not the technology of tomorrow. So I think if you roll all that up and say, in the face of those deeply polarizing discussions that are evident out there, and this potential impending train wreck is with these two inexorable forces on a bit of a collision course, I think it'd be quite easy just to throw up your hands and say, well, it's just impossible or very difficult to chart a path forward. That's the wrong answer. I think these are not insurmountable problems, but we need to find a way to work much more collaboratively and much more in the solution space if we're going to make progress and on the ground and despite that very challenging external context. So if we look at technology and innovation and what can we do in Alberta on the ground to make progress around pathways to net zero and energy and economic sustainability, investment in technology and innovation is going to be a critical factor. I think we'd all agree. I think those investments need to address two imperatives. The first is to sustain the competitiveness and reduce GHG emissions from our existing economy. And the second is to leverage our current strengths and pursue new initiatives to create a competitive future economy. We need to do both of those things. And Jim, back to your point, I think too often it's one or the other, but not both. It's not all going to be new, and it's not all going to be old. We need to find a way to find the right mix between them. There's, I think, numerous examples of great work being done in Alberta on the technology and innovation front. And that great work, I think, has all kinds of potential in terms of transforming the Alberta economy and addressing greenhouse gas emissions. But I think it's also got relevance and applicability both nationally and globally that often doesn't get enough recognition. So just to touch on a few examples, and this is by no means intended to be a complete list. COSIA, Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, now about a decade old, very innovative collaborative alliance among oil sands companies. It continues to deliver game-changing technology and greenhouse gas emissions, land, water, tailings, etc. PTAC, the Petroleum Technology Alliance of Canada, is doing great work on methane detection and mitigation, which is relevant, obviously, in the natural gas sector, particularly in Canada, but has broad applicability, I think, in the production and processing of natural gas nationally and globally. Eddie mentioned small modular nuclear reactors. Canadian Nuclear Association, the federal government, the provincial, a number of provincial governments have really created some renewed momentum around SMRs, which have potential for use in the oil sands. Still some issues to be resolved, but as a source of energy to reduce the use of natural gas for steam generation. The Oil Sands Pathway to Net Zero initiative, again, I think a potential game-changing alliance among Canada's largest oil sands producers to work together on pathways to net zero. The initial focus is on building out a carbon capture network in northern Alberta. I think, Jim, you mentioned earlier, and it's hard to foresee any pathway to net zero in Canada that does not involve CCUS at a significant scale. Alberta Innovates doing some really positive work, I think, on technology development in many areas. Hydrogen, bitumen beyond combustion are ones that stand out for me. And finally, you mentioned Emissions Reduction Alberta, Jim. Again, an organization that invests the carbon levy, the revenue from the carbon levy on large final emitters across a range of sectors in the economy: oil and gas, low emitting electricity, bio, and industrial processes and products. So we've got an awful lot of good work going on in Alberta, I think, that often doesn't get enough recognition. More can and should be done, I would argue, to amplify and accelerate those current efforts. And just to build on a comment that I think Eddie made, I think there's clearly a role for the federal government to play a larger role in funding and supporting some of these initiatives that are important to Alberta and to Canada. So let me just wrap up with a few thoughts on key considerations, as I would characterize it, that I believe should inform our decision-making as we look forward toward a pathway to energy, economic, and environmental sustainability, as the webinar was framed. The first is that I think we need to have a much more grounded, balanced, and pragmatic dialogue about solutions to the energy and climate challenge and how it may play out in a global, national, and regional context. I think aspirational objectives are great. They may help to motivate and create the case for change, but that approach only goes so far. And I think we're at the point where we need to have a bit of a hard reality check, if you will, and deal with some of the tough issues that people don't seem to want to directly deal with. As an engineer, I can say this: perhaps we need a few more engineers around the table and a few less climate scientists. I think the problem is well understood. The solutions need some work. Second, we need to start to, I think, more consistently and more deliberately view net zero not as a climate aspiration or in the climate silo, but rather as an integrated energy, environmental / climate economy challenge. This is an extremely complex systems challenge. It's not a climate problem in and of itself. And far too much of the discussion, I think, today takes place in silos. And we are not going to make the progress we need to make unless we can take a more cross-cutting approach and a more integrated approach. We need better planning, better process, and more collaboration across those silos if we're going to make progress. Third, this is definitely not a smooth transition. I think it's a transformation, not a transition to net zero. Nor is there one pathway. We aren't smart enough to figure out what that pathway is. There's multiple potential pathways. It's going to be a very long, very disruptive, very challenging road ahead. And all that to say that I think we need to look at this complex systems problem in more of a scenarios context than more of a portfolio context. There is no one right answer, and we need to look at a diversity of potential solutions. Fourth, as I characterize it, we need to ride two horses. It's far from clear to me at this point how Canada is going to be able to compete in the at scale as we transition to net zero. And it seems frankly absurd to me that we would jump off our current resource-based economic horse before we have a horse or horses to jump onto. And those horses we would potentially jump onto are far from evident at the moment. So I think we need to realize that our current economy, albeit one with lower GHG emissions, needs to play a significant role. And it can help to provide the financial and other capacity to help us transition to a more diverse and more diverse economy into new opportunities. And fifth and finally, I think we need to realize that the future of many of our resource-based, export-oriented resource sectors are going to, including oil and gas, are going to be driven largely by what happens in the marketplace, not so much by what we do internally in Canada. Although I wouldn't underestimate our ability to mess it up if given the opportunity. But I think what's really important is that we ought to have and should have the opportunity to participate in global markets, to compete in those global markets, and demand in those global markets at the end of the day will dictate in my view, largely the pace and nature of the transition that we need to undertake in Canada. So let me just wrap up with a couple of quick points. I think the first, I just emphasize the need for a reality check, the tough conversation, and dealing with those issues that people don't seem to want to deal with. If we deal with them constructively, collaboratively, it'll serve us much better in the end. We can and should ride two horses. Let's enhance our current economy. Let's deal with emissions from our current economic structure, and let's use that to leverage and create opportunities for the future. Let's recognize that we can do more, but there's an awful lot of good work being done on technology and innovation in Canada and in Alberta, and it's relevant nationally and it's relevant on a global scale in many cases. Let's not sell ourselves short with regard to the impressive work that is being done. And finally, I just highlight the fact that we need to get this message out there more effectively, more consistently. It needs to be grounded in results and deliverables, but we've got a good story to tell, and we all need to work to tell that story better and more consistently. So I'll leave it at that, Jim, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much for that great overview, Dave. You made some really good points, and I like you did it a lot more eloquently than I did in my opening remarks around, the systems challenge, which is kind of what I was trying to get at about, how we need to really look at industry. We need to look at the regulatory approval process. We need to look at the economics of what we're doing and make sure that those are all in balance as we go forward. But I think one of the ones, and you touched on it too, is that we also need to have governments in Canada indicating and being supportive of what industry is trying to do. Industry's been asked to do this, and now we've been challenged to go out and solve this problem. But you've got absolutely no indication, certainly not at the federal government level, as to whether it'll be appreciated, it's even wanted. It's not being supported verbally at all. Anytime I look, I can't find that. So even though they're obviously going to need to be involved in funding some of this, but they also need to be there for moral support for the people that are trying to do this. And Eric, I go back to the National Oil Sands Task Force work that you led. you were constantly working with the politicians to make sure they were on side and looking for signals from them that indicated that they were, as you were moving the whole thing forward. We don't get any of that opportunity now today. And I'll just remind everybody that that was a Liberal Prime Minister working with a very conservative Alberta Premier that joined together to do something of significant national benefit called the oil sands. And we haven't seen any of that recently, certainly not in the last 4 or 5 years. And if we're going to undertake something like this for the Canadian economy, we've got to have that. We've got to have that. We've got to have that tough dialogue that you talked about.
Well, I think Jim, to your point, some of us have been involved in the notion of some sort of energy strategy, industrial strategy, whatever you want to call it, for quite some time. And I think the Oil Sands Task Force is a good example of what can be achieved if there's clarity of purpose.
Right.
But we haven't had that clarity of purpose. And in fact, I think we operate at cross purposes many times. And I think that makes it very difficult for industry business in Canada to sort of, what needs to be done. And amid all of that uncertainty, now, people need to take decisions, they need to move forward. But I think if we had a more aligned and consistent approach to strategy around energy and climate, we'd be much better off. Now, going to my point about tough choices, I think one of the reasons we haven't had that is it actually does force tough choices and tough conversations. And my experience in a lot of this is that there's a tremendous capacity of people to try and avoid the necessity of having those conversations, but they're needed. And that's, I think that's where we need to get to, but haven't been successful in doing so far. We have been involved, like Kate, in these discussions about communications for way too long. My takeaway is two things. One is the public is, for the most part, at least a general level, very concerned about the environment, and they take the energy system for granted. So we can talk all we want about how we engage with that. I think personally, and I hope this doesn't happen, but I think it's going to take a bit of a wake-up call, similar to what we're seeing in the UK, to actually get people's attention. Because until it actually resonates and impacts them directly, I think it's a very esoteric and somewhat detached issue. So we'll see how it unfolds, but I can assure people that the brightest brains in communications in Canada have been involved in this subject of how to communicate around this subject for the last 15 years.